The silence of the high plains was a living thing, a weight composed of shimmering heat and the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. Conrad felt it pressed down on his shoulders, a familiar companion after years spent drifting from one dusty town to the next. He was a man shaped by emptiness, his past a scorched field he never looked back on, his future a horizon he never seemed to reach. His horse, a sturdy roan named Dust, shifted beneath him, the creak of worn leather the only sound for miles. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked earth and sagebrush. It was a loneliness so profound it had its own texture, its own taste. He had long ago accepted it as the price of his survival, the armor that kept the world at bay. He was moving, always moving, because to stand still was to let the ghosts catch up. He had stopped at this small, willow-choked creek to water his horse, a brief pause in a life of perpetual motion. And then the silence broke. It was not the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a snake in the grass. It was laughter, clear and bright as the water tumbling over the rocks, a sound so utterly out of place in his desolate world that he froze, one hand on the butt of his pistol, his senses instantly sharp. It was a woman's laugh, free and unburdened, and it held a note of pure, unadulterated mirth that felt like a foreign language. He dismounted, his movements fluid and cautious, tethering Dust to a low-hanging branch. The sound came again, a delightful peal of amusement that drew him forward like a moth to a flame. He pushed aside a curtain of weeping willow branches, and his world, which had been painted in shades of dust and regret for a decade, exploded into color. There, in the middle of the creek bed, was a young woman sunk to her knees in a thick patch of gray, sucking mud. She was impossibly beautiful, with hair as black as a raven's wing and skin like porcelain. She wore a simple prairie dress of a delicate light pink, now splattered and stained at the hem, and she was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling with humor at her own absurd predicament. In that instant, something inside Conrad, a lock he hadn't known existed, shattered. It wasn't just attraction. It was a tectonic shift in the landscape of his soul. He saw not a damsel in distress, but a beacon of joy shining in the mire. He saw a woman who could find laughter while trapped, and in that moment he knew he had been the one who was truly stuck, sinking in a mud of his own making for years. He had stopped wondering. He was home. He watched her for a long moment, a lifetime passing in the space of a few heartbeats. The world weariness that had settled deep in his bones began to recede, replaced by a feeling so potent and unfamiliar it almost brought him to his knees. Hope. He had seen 1,000 hard faces, 100 desperate towns, but he had never seen anything as true as the sight of this woman laughing at her own misfortune. He finally stepped out from behind the willows, his boots making a soft sound on the grassy bank. Her laughter caught in her throat, and her eyes, the color of warm honey, widened in surprise. She was not afraid, he noted, merely startled. A flicker of apprehension crossed her features, but it was quickly replaced by a wry, self-deprecating smile. "Well," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality as her laugh, with a slight, beautiful accent he couldn't quite place. "It seems I have found myself in a rather undignified situation." Conrad felt the corners of his own mouth, so long set in a grim line, twitch upwards. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt both natural and strangely momentous. "It appears so, ma'am," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. He walked to the edge of the bank, studying the thick mud that held her fast. "Looks like this creek has a strong opinion on where you ought to be." Her smile widened. "It would seem its opinion is that I should stay here forever and become a permanent landmark." He could have stood there all day just listening to her talk, but the sun was high and hot. Without another word, he turned back to his saddle, uncoiling the lariat from its horn. The rope felt different in his hands now, not a tool for wrangling cattle or for defense, but a lifeline he could offer to the center of his new world. He returned to the bank and expertly spun a small, soft loop. "If you'll allow me," he said, his tone formal and sincere, "I believe I can offer a second opinion." She looked at the rope, then back at his face, her gaze perceptive and intelligent. She seemed to be weighing not the logistics of the rescue, but the character of the rescuer. Whatever she saw in his eyes, the profound, unwavering sincerity that had just been born there, seemed to satisfy her. She nodded, a small, trusting gesture that tightened his chest. "I would be most grateful," she said. "My name is Leanne." "Conrad," he said, the name sounding new on his own tongue. He tossed the loop and it fell perfectly around her waist, a gentle embrace of braided rope. He pulled the slack, dug his heels into the soft earth, and began to pull, every muscle straining not just to free her from the mud, but to pull himself into a future he hadn't dared to imagine existed only moments before. The resistance was formidable. The mud clung to her with a greedy, sucking tenacity, a physical manifestation of the inertia he had felt for so long. Conrad leaned back, the muscles in his arms and back burning with the effort, his boots sliding slightly on the damp grass. He was a capable man, his strength honed by years of hard living, but this felt like more than just a physical struggle. It was a test. He glanced at Leanne, who was holding onto the rope with both hands, her expression a mixture of determination and a lingering amusement. "It seems I am more trouble than I appear," she called out, her voice strained but still light. "Never," he grunted, planting his feet more firmly. "Just firmly rooted." A small laugh escaped her lips, and the sound gave him a fresh surge of strength. He gave a final, mighty heave. There was a loud, wet, slurping sound, and suddenly she was free, stumbling forward onto the firmer ground at the water's edge, the rope falling slack between them. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath, covered in gray mud from the knees down. Her pink dress was a disaster, but her face was radiant. "Thank you, Conrad," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You are very strong." He simply nodded, coiling his rope, his heart hammering against his ribs for reasons that had nothing to do with the exertion. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to keep that light in her eyes from ever dimming. He walked to his horse and returned with his canteen. "Here," he offered. She took it and rinsed her hands, then splashed water on her legs, washing away the worst of the clinging mud. He found himself watching the simple, graceful movements of her hands, captivated. "My aunt and uncle will be wondering where I've gotten to," she said, looking in the direction of the rising sun. "I was gathering wildflowers by the ridge when I thought a shortcut through the creek was a clever idea. It seems my cleverness has its limits." He saw his opening, a chance to extend this impossible moment. "I can walk you home," he said, the words coming out more as a statement than a question, "to make sure you don't find any more stubborn patches of earth." She looked up at him, her honey-colored eyes seeming to see right through the rough exterior he presented to the world. "I would like that very much," she said softly. The walk was a revelation. He led his horse with one hand, acutely aware of Leanne walking beside him. The silence between them wasn't empty like the silence he was used to. It was filled with a quiet, comfortable energy. He learned that she lived with her aunt and uncle on a small farmstead a few miles east, that they had come from a place far away across the ocean to build a new life. She spoke of them with such love and warmth that he felt a pang of an emotion so old he could barely name it. Envy. She did not ask him where he was from or where he was going. Instead, she asked him about his horse, about the clouds in the sky, about whether he thought the wild roses smelled sweeter this year than last. Her questions were simple, yet they made him see the world around him with fresh eyes. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't just passing through a landscape. He was in it, a part of it, and it was beautiful. They arrived at a small, immaculately kept farm nestled in a shallow valley. A modest but sturdy farmhouse stood beside a large, thriving vegetable garden, and a whitewashed fence enclosed a pasture where 2 cows grazed peacefully. It was an oasis of order and care in the wild landscape. As they approached, an older woman with Leanne's kind eyes and a stern, protective set to her mouth came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was followed by a man of similar age, his face weathered by sun and hard work, his gaze sharp and intelligent. "Leanne," the woman called out, her voice a mixture of relief and concern. "Where have you been? And who is this?" Leanne smiled reassuringly. "Aunt Suyin, Uncle Wei, this is Conrad. I had a small adventure in the creek, and he was kind enough to rescue me." She gestured to her still muddy dress with a playful grimace. Uncle Wei's eyes narrowed, taking in Conrad from head to toe, the worn duster, the dusty boots, and the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. It was a look Conrad had seen 1,000 times, the instant assessment of a man who carried a gun, the unspoken question of whether he brought trouble. But for the first time, the judgment of others mattered to him. He wanted, more than anything, to be found worthy. He stood straight, meeting the older man's gaze without aggression, his expression calm and respectful. "It was my pleasure, sir," Conrad said, his voice even. "Your niece handles trouble with more grace than most." Aunt Suyin bustled down the steps, her focus entirely on Leanne, fussing over her and tut-tutting about the state of her dress while simultaneously scanning her for any injury. Uncle Wei remained on the porch, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Conrad. "You have our thanks," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "There are not many who would stop to help a stranger." "There are not many strangers like your niece," Conrad replied honestly, the words leaving his lips before he could second-guess them. The statement hung in the air, simple and sincere. He saw a flicker of surprise in the old man's eyes. Leanne, overhearing him, blushed faintly, a warmth spreading across her cheeks that he found utterly enchanting. Aunt Suyin led Leanne inside, chattering about a warm bath and a change of clothes. Uncle Wei gestured for Conrad to join him on the porch. "You are a long way from any town, mister," Wei stated, his eyes missing nothing. "I am," Conrad agreed, not offering any more. He would not lie to this man, nor would he offer up a history he wasn't ready to share. He would simply be who he was in this moment, a man who wished to stay. "We are simple people. We farm this land. We do not seek out trouble." "And I am not bringing any," Conrad said quietly. "I was just passing through." The words felt like a lie as soon as he said them. He was no longer just passing through. He had come to a full and complete stop. His journey had ended here, in this small, peaceful valley, the moment he had heard the sound of laughter. Conrad knew he needed a reason to linger, an excuse to stay within the orbit of Leanne's light. As Uncle Wei watched him with that same penetrating gaze, an idea formed, born of a desperate need not to ride away. His eyes fell upon a section of the pasture fence where 2 rails were split and sagging. "I notice your fence needs mending," Conrad said, his voice casual but his intention anything but. "I'm capable with an axe and hammer. I'd be willing to fix it in exchange for a meal and a place to rest my horse for the night." Wei considered the offer, his eyes moving from the fence to Conrad and back again. It was a fair trade, a common enough arrangement in these parts. It was also a test. A drifter looking for a handout might make such an offer, but his follow-through would reveal his true character. "The wood is stacked behind the barn," Wei said finally, a silent agreement. "You will find the tools there as well." And so Conrad stayed. He worked with a focus and diligence he hadn't applied to anything in years. He split new rails from a fallen log, his movements precise and economical, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady counterpoint to the quiet hum of the farm. He pulled the old splintered wood free and fitted the new rails, securing them with a strength that spoke of permanence. Leanne brought him a dipper of cool water from the well in the heat of the afternoon. She stood a few feet away as he drank, a quiet presence that was more restorative than the water itself. "You work hard," she observed. "It's good work," he replied, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Honest work." He was used to the work of survival, of watching his back and anticipating threats. This work, mending, building, creating something whole from something broken, felt profoundly different. It felt like healing. That evening he sat at their table and shared a meal of chicken, rice, and vegetables from their garden. The food was simple and delicious, but it was the company that nourished him. He listened as they spoke, their conversation flowing easily, a mix of their native tongue and the English they had learned. He learned about their journey, the hardships they had faced, and their unwavering determination to build a peaceful life. He spoke little about himself, answering their polite questions with brief, honest replies, but he listened with an intensity that did not go unnoticed. He watched the way Leanne teased her uncle, the deep affection between her and her aunt. He was witnessing the quiet, sturdy architecture of family, a structure he had thought lost to him forever. After dinner, he sat on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to prick the deep violet sky. The loneliness he had carried for so long felt like a distant memory, a coat he had finally taken off and left behind. He was no longer just a wanderer. He was a man mending a fence, a man hoping he might be given a reason to build another. Several days passed in a similar rhythm. The fence was mended, but Conrad found other tasks. He repaired a hinge on the barn door, cleared stones from a new patch of land Uncle Way intended to plow, and helped reinforce a small section of the farmhouse roof. He worked from sun up to sundown, asking for nothing more than food and a place to sleep in the hayloft. He was earning his keep, but more than that, he was earning their trust. Uncle Way's initial suspicion had softened into a quiet, watchful respect. Aunt Suyin now smiled at him freely and always made sure he had the largest portion at supper. But it was the time he spent near Leanne that truly anchored him. They rarely had long conversations, but their connection grew in the spaces between words. It grew when she handed him a tool, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. It grew when their eyes met across the dinner table, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. It grew in the evenings when she would sit on the porch swing, humming a soft melody, and he would sit on the steps, simply content to be near her. One evening, after a long day of labor, he was cleaning his tools by the fading light when Leanne approached him. She was carrying a small bowl of fresh peaches, sliced and glistening with juice. "Aunt Suyin said you deserved these," she said, holding the bowl out to him. He took it, their hands touching for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He sat on an upturned bucket and ate the peaches, the sweet flavor a balm on his parched throat. She did not leave, but leaned against a post of the barn, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the hills. "You carry a great sadness with you, Conrad," she said, her voice not pitying but matter of fact. "It is in your eyes, even when you smile." Her directness disarmed him. No one had ever dared to name the ghost that haunted him. People saw the gun, the hard set of his jaw, and they kept their distance. They did not look closely enough to see the sorrow. He stopped eating and looked down at the empty bowl in his hands. Some things are not easily left behind. Perhaps they are not meant to be left behind, she countered gently. Perhaps they are meant to be carried, but with help, so the weight does not break you. He looked up at her then, silhouetted against the twilight sky. He saw no judgment in her face, only a profound and gentle wisdom. He had spent a decade running, believing that if he just kept moving, the weight would eventually fall away. But Leanne was suggesting something else entirely, that strength was not found in outrunning the darkness, but in finding a light to carry with you through it. In that moment, he felt the tightly coiled knot of his past begin to loosen, strand by painful strand. He finally spoke of it, the words rusty and difficult. "There was a fire," he began, his voice low and strained. "A long time ago. My home, my family. I was the only one who made it out." He didn't offer details of the horror, the smoke, the screams. He couldn't. He simply laid the raw, unvarnished fact of his loss between them in the gathering dark. He waited for the pity, the awkward condolences. Instead, she moved closer and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You are not a ghost from a fire, Conrad," she said, her voice firm and clear. "You are the man who mended our fence. You are here." Her words were not an absolution, but an affirmation. She was not trying to erase his past, but was instead anchoring him firmly in the present. He felt a profound shift within him, a release of pressure that made him feel lightheaded. The weight was still there, but for the first time he was not carrying it alone. He looked at her, at this beacon of joy, who was unafraid of his darkness, and he knew, with a certainty that eclipsed everything else, that he loved her. The next day, Conrad knew what he had to do. The wandering was over. The running was done. His future was not some distant, hazy horizon. It was here, in this valley, with this woman. After the morning chores were finished, he found Uncle Way inspecting the new rows in the vegetable garden. Conrad approached him, his heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. He stood before the older man, hat in hand, feeling more vulnerable and yet more certain than he had ever felt in his life. "Uncle Way," he began, using the term of respect he had heard Leanne use, "may I have a word with you?" Way straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers, and gave Conrad his full attention. His eyes were as shrewd as ever, but they held no trace of their initial suspicion. "Speak," he said. "I am not a farmer," Conrad stated simply. "I have no land to my name, and the only trade I know is the one I wish to leave behind. What I have is my strength, my honor, and a promise. I love your niece, Leanne. I love her more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I wish to build a life here, to protect her and provide for her, and spend the rest of my days making sure that light in her eyes never fades." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I am asking for your blessing to marry her." He had laid his soul bare. He had no dowry, no prospects, nothing to offer but the raw, unshakable truth of his devotion. Way was silent for a long time, his gaze distant as he looked out over the land he had worked so hard to cultivate. He looked at the farmhouse, at the mended fence, at the sturdy barn. He looked at Conrad, a man who had arrived as a stranger and had, through quiet diligence and transparent sincerity, become a part of the place. "A man's worth is not in the land he owns," Way said finally, his voice raspy with emotion. "It is in the strength of his hands and the truth in his heart. I have seen you work. I have seen the way you look at her. You see her, not just her beauty, but her spirit. That is a rare thing." He placed a calloused hand on Conrad's shoulder. "You have my blessing." Relief washed over Conrad so powerfully his knees felt weak. He had passed the most important test. Later that evening he asked Leanne to walk with him down to the creek, to the very spot where he had first seen her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink. The air was warm and smelled of willow and damp earth. They stood on the bank, the memory of their first meeting hanging sweetly between them. "I came here a drifter, Leanne," he said, turning to face her. "My life was empty. I was just moving from one day to the next. And then I heard you laugh." He took her hands in his. "You pulled me out of a deeper mud than you could ever imagine. I love you. I want to build a house with you, a home. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. Will you marry me?" He had no ring, nothing to offer but his words were the truest things he possessed. Leanne's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. Her smile was the most brilliant sunrise he had ever seen. "Yes, Conrad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." He drew her into his arms, and in that embrace, two solitary lives became one, their future as vast and as promising as the star-filled sky beginning to unfold above them. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the shade of a large oak tree in the pasture. Leanne wore a new dress, this one a soft shade of blue that matched the sky, sewn by her aunt. Conrad wore a clean shirt and trousers, his gun belt left behind in the barn, a conscious shedding of his former life. The only guests were Aunt Sue Yin and Uncle Way. An itinerant preacher passing through the territory performed the ceremony, his words about devotion and partnership echoing in the quiet afternoon air. When Conrad looked at Leanne as he said his vows, he saw his entire world, his past, present, and future, reflected in her joyful eyes. He promised to love and honor her, promises that felt less like obligations and more like the fundamental purpose of his existence. After the ceremony, they shared a small feast prepared by Sue Yin, and Wei gifted them a small plot of land at the far end of his property, a place with a gentle slope and a view of the entire valley. Their new life began with the felling of the first tree for their home. Conrad swung the axe, the clean bite into the wood a satisfying thud that marked the start of their foundation. Leanne worked alongside him, clearing brush, carrying smaller logs, her presence a constant source of strength and motivation. They built the house slowly, meticulously, with their own four hands. It was a small, sturdy cabin with a single room that was a kitchen, a parlor, and a bedroom all in one. But to them, it was a palace. Every nail he hammered, every plank he set in place, was an act of love. He was not just building a shelter, he was building a sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of his past could never find him. The first winter was harsh, with heavy snows that cut them off from the nearest town for weeks. They huddled by the stone fireplace Conrad had built, sharing stories, their warmth a defiant answer to the cold outside. In the spring, they planted their own garden. Leanne showed him how to coax life from the soil, her gentle hands turning the dark earth. He, in turn, used his strength to dig and plow, finding a deep, grounding satisfaction in the work. His hands, once calloused by the grip of a pistol, were now calloused by the handle of a shovel. He was no longer a man who took, but a man who cultivated. Their life was not easy. It was a constant struggle against the elements, against the unforgiving nature of the land. But it was a shared struggle. They faced every challenge together, their bond deepening with each hardship overcome. The quiet contentment he felt was more profound than any fleeting thrill he had known before. The emptiness inside him had been filled, not with noise or distraction, but with the quiet, steady presence of love. He would often pause in his work and just watch her, whether she was hanging laundry on the line, her blue dress bright against the green landscape, or humming as she kneaded dough. And in those moments he would feel a wave of gratitude so immense it was almost painful. He was home. Decades flowed by like water in the creek where they had met. The small cabin grew, a new room added here, a wider porch there, each addition marking a new chapter in their shared life. The saplings Conrad had planted around their home grew into tall, strong trees that offered shade in the summer and broke the force of the winter wind. Their small patch of land expanded, merging with the farm of Aunt Su-Yin and Uncle Wei, becoming one prosperous and thriving homestead. They were known in the territory as hard-working, honest people, their farm a testament to their enduring partnership. Conrad's hair became streaked with gray at the temples, and lines of laughter and concern were etched around his eyes and mouth. He was no longer the lean, haunted drifter. He was a man of substance, his shoulders broadened by years of labor, his hands strong and capable. Leanne's beauty did not fade but deepened, transforming into a mature grace. The youthful sparkle in her eyes remained, a constant flame that had guided him for years. They had faced droughts that turned their fields to dust and floods that threatened to wash away everything they had built. They had weathered sickness and sorrow, including the peaceful passing of Aunt Su-Yin and, a few years later, Uncle Wei. They buried them on a small hill overlooking the farm, a place where their spirits could watch over the life they had helped to create. Through all of life's trials, their love was the bedrock. It was in the way he would bring her the first wildflower of spring. It was in the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him when he came in from the fields, bone-weary and covered in dust. It was in the comfortable silences that fell between them, silences that were not empty, but full of a shared history, of an understanding so complete that words were often unnecessary. The memory of their first meeting became a cherished story, a piece of family lore. Sometimes, on a warm summer evening, they would walk down to the creek. He would look at the spot where she had been stuck, and he would feel the same jolt, the same soul-deep recognition he had felt all those years ago. "You were a ridiculous sight," he would tease her gently, "laughing in the mud, with your fancy pink dress ruined." She would lean her head on his shoulder, her hand finding his. "And you were the most serious-looking man I had ever seen," she would reply, her voice full of warmth. "I think you needed to see someone being ridiculous. I think you needed to laugh." And he knew she was right. Her laughter had been the key that had unlocked his frozen heart. It was a sound that had echoed through all their years together, a recurring motif of joy that had defined their life. The gun he had once carried now lay wrapped in an oilcloth at the bottom of a wooden chest, a relic from a different man's life. He had found a truer, more lasting form of strength in the love he shared with Leanne. The sun was a wash of soft gold, sinking behind the western hills and setting the valley ablaze with its final, gentle fire. Conrad sat in his favorite rocking chair on the porch they had built together, his old bones creaking in time with the chair. His hands, gnarled and weathered by a lifetime of hard work, rested on his knees. Beside him, in a matching chair, sat Leanne. Her hair was a cloud of silver, and the skin around her eyes was a fine web of wrinkles, each one a map of the thousands of times she had smiled. She was knitting something, her needles clicking in a soft, rhythmic pattern that was as familiar and comforting to him as his own heartbeat. He wasn't watching her hands. He was watching her face, illuminated by the warm glow of the setting sun, and he saw it, as clear and as bright as it had been on that first day, the light, the indomitable, joyful light in her eyes that had captivated him from the moment he laid eyes on her. It had not dimmed with age or hardship. If anything, it had grown deeper, more luminous, polished by the years. He thought back to the man he had been, the hollow shell who had ridden into this valley with nothing but a horse and a past he was trying to outrun. He had believed his life was over, that he was doomed to wander forever in a gray, silent world. He had been so certain that his story was one of loss. But he had been wrong. His story had not truly begun until the moment he heard the sound of her laughter. That single, unexpected note of joy had been the inciting incident, the turning point that had given his life meaning, direction, and profound, enduring happiness. He had not run from his past. He had run directly into his future. Leanne looked up from her knitting as if sensing his gaze and gave him a soft smile. "What are you thinking about, my love?" she asked, her voice a little thinner now, but still carrying that same musical quality. Conrad reached out and took her hand, his rough, calloused palm fitting perfectly against hers. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble, "that I am the luckiest man who ever lived." Her smile widened, and she squeezed his hand. "We are lucky," she corrected him gently. They sat in comfortable silence as the last rays of sunlight faded and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The crickets began their nightly chorus, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the tall trees he had planted. His journey was over. He had traveled across dusty plains and through dangerous towns, searching for something he couldn't name, only to find it here, in the steadfast love of a woman who had taught him how to live again. He was home. He was at peace, and his heart was full.